The blood on the floorboards had turned black with age, but Caleb Monroe could still see where it pooled beneath the dusty grain sacks in the abandoned warehouse on the edge of Tombstone, Arizona, and he knew in that moment that everything was about to change. It was late September 1885, and the desert heat still clung to the evening air like a heavy blanket as Caleb knelt down to examine what he had stumbled upon. He had only come to this forgotten building because his horse had thrown a shoe nearby and he needed somewhere to wait while the blacksmith finished his work. At 26 years old, Caleb had spent the last 8 years working as a ranch hand and occasional tracker for the local law, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was looking at now. The bloodstains were old, maybe 5 or 6 years, but preserved by the dry Arizona climate. More importantly, there were markings carved into the floorboards beside them, markings that looked like initials and a date. Caleb struck a match and held it closer to the floor, his heart pounding as he made out the letters. JT and a date from March 1880. His breath caught in his throat. James Thompson. Everyone in Tombstone knew that name, even though most people did not talk about it anymore. James Thompson had been a respected merchant who disappeared without a trace 5 years ago, leaving behind a young daughter and a mystery that haunted the town. The sheriff at the time had investigated for months but found nothing. Eventually, people stopped asking questions, and the case went cold. Caleb stood up slowly, his mind racing through the implications. If this was blood from James Thompson, then the man had not simply run off like some people whispered. He had been murdered right here in this warehouse, and whoever killed him had gotten away with it for 5 years. Caleb knew he had to report this to Sheriff Coleman immediately, but as he turned to leave, he heard footsteps outside. He froze, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside, silhouetted against the fading sunlight. She was slender and wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. When she saw Caleb, she gasped and took a step backward. "I am sorry," she said quickly, her voice soft but steady. "I did not know anyone was here. I thought this place was abandoned." Caleb relaxed slightly but kept his position between her and the blood-stained floor. "It is abandoned," he said carefully. "What brings you here, ma'am?" The woman hesitated, studying his face in the dim light. She had striking green eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness, and Caleb felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with the discovery he had just made. She looked to be in her early 20s with delicate features and an air of quiet determination. "My name is Sarah Thompson," she said finally. "This warehouse belonged to my father." Caleb felt his stomach drop. Sarah Thompson, James Thompson's daughter. He had seen her around town over the years, but had never spoken to her directly. She would have been only 17 or 18 when her father disappeared, and the tragedy had clearly marked her. She lived quietly on the outskirts of Tombstone, working as a seamstress to support herself. "Miss Thompson," Caleb said gently, removing his hat, "I am Caleb Monroe. I think you should sit down. I have found something you need to see." Sarah's face went pale, but she stepped forward with surprising courage. "What is it? What have you found?" Caleb showed her the bloodstains and the carved initials, watching as tears filled her eyes. She sank to her knees beside the markings, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the letters. "He carved his own initials," she whispered. "He knew he was going to die, and he left a message." She looked up at Caleb with those haunting green eyes. "All these years, people said he abandoned me. They said he ran off with gambling debts or another woman, but I knew he would never do that. I knew something terrible had happened." Caleb knelt beside her, feeling a protective instinct rise within him. "I believe you, Miss Thompson, and I promise you, I am going to help find out who did this to your father. Justice may be 5 years late, but it is coming." Sarah met his gaze, and something passed between them in that moment, something neither of them could name, but both felt deeply. "Why would you help me?" she asked quietly. "You do not even know me." "Because it is the right thing to do," Caleb said simply. and because no one should have to carry this kind of pain alone. They went together to find Sheriff Coleman, who was finishing his evening rounds on Allen Street. The sheriff was a grizzled man in his 50s with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen too much violence. When Caleb explained what they had found, Coleman's expression grew grave. "I remember that case," Coleman said, rubbing his jaw. "Sheriff Daniels worked himself half to death trying to find James Thompson. Never turned up a single lead." He looked at Sarah with sympathy. "Miss Thompson, I know this is hard, but are you certain those are your father's initials?" "I am certain," Sarah said firmly. "My father always carved his initials that way, with the J slightly larger than the T. I would recognize his work anywhere." Coleman nodded slowly. "All right, then. Monroe, you have a good eye. I want you to work with me on this officially. I will deputize you temporarily so you have authority to ask questions and investigate. This town owes it to James Thompson and his daughter to finally get to the truth." Over the next few days, Caleb threw himself into the investigation with a passion that surprised even him. He interviewed old witnesses, reviewed Sheriff Daniels' original notes, and spent hours at the warehouse looking for additional evidence. Sarah insisted on helping, despite Caleb's initial protests. She proved to be invaluable, with a sharp mind and a memory for details about her father's business dealings that no one else possessed. They worked closely together from dawn until dusk, and Caleb found himself increasingly drawn to Sarah's quiet strength and intelligence. She had survived 5 years of whispered gossip and financial hardship without losing her dignity or her faith that the truth would eventually emerge. When she smiled, which was rare, it lit up her entire face and made Caleb's heart skip a beat. One evening, as they sat in the sheriff's office reviewing documents by lamplight, Sarah suddenly looked up at Caleb with an expression of realization. "The ledger," she said breathlessly. "My father kept a private ledger at home, separate from his business books. After he disappeared, I could never find it. I thought maybe he had it with him when he vanished, but what if he hid it somewhere?" "What kind of information would be in this ledger?" Caleb asked, leaning forward. "Everything," Sarah said. "Every business deal, every debt owed to him or by him, every person he had dealings with. My father was meticulous about record keeping. If someone had a reason to want him dead, it would be in that ledger." Caleb stood up, his mind racing. "Where would he hide something that important? Somewhere only you might think to look?" Sarah closed her eyes, thinking hard. Then they opened wide with sudden understanding. "The music box," she whispered. "My mother's music box. He gave it to me after she died and told me to keep it always, that it held precious memories. I thought he meant memories of her, but what if he meant something more literal?" They rushed to Sarah's small house on the edge of town, a modest structure that she kept impeccably clean despite its worn furnishings. Sarah went straight to her bedroom and retrieved an ornate wooden music box from her dresser. Her hands shook as she examined it more closely than she had in years. "Here," Caleb said gently, taking it from her. "Let me look." He turned the box over carefully, running his fingers along the base. There was a nearly invisible seam that suggested a false bottom. Using his pocket knife with delicate precision, he pried it open. Inside was a small leather-bound ledger, perfectly preserved. Sarah gasped and grabbed the ledger, flipping through pages filled with her father's neat handwriting. Caleb watched her face as she read, seeing anger and vindication flash across her features. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry from February 1880, a month before her father disappeared. "Victor Hastings owed my father $8,000. That is a fortune. And look at these notes. My father wrote that Hastings refused to pay and threatened him when he tried to collect." Caleb knew the name Victor Hastings well. He was one of the wealthiest men in Tombstone, owner of several successful mines and a prominent figure in local politics. He was also known for his ruthless business practices and his violent temper. "This is dangerous, Sarah," Caleb said seriously. "Hastings has a lot of power in this town. If we accuse him of murder without solid proof, he could destroy us both." Sarah looked at him with fierce determination. "I do not care about the danger. This is my father's life we are talking about. His memory. I have lived under a cloud of shame for 5 years because people thought he abandoned me. I will not let that stand any longer, no matter the cost. Caleb felt his admiration for her grow even stronger. Then we do this right, he said. We gather every piece of evidence we can find, and we build a case so strong that Hastings cannot escape justice. They returned to Sheriff Coleman with the ledger, and together the three of them began to construct a timeline. According to the ledger and other documents, Hastings had borrowed money from James Thompson to invest in a mining venture that went bust. When Thompson demanded repayment, Hastings had stalled for months. The final entry in the ledger, dated March 10th, 1880, noted that Thompson planned to file a lawsuit against Hastings the following week. James Thompson disappeared on March 15th, 1880, before he could file those legal papers. "We need witnesses," Coleman said, stroking his mustache. "Someone who saw Hastings near that warehouse around that time, or someone who heard him make threats." Caleb spent the next week tracking down everyone who had worked at or near the warehouse in March 1880. Most had moved on or died, but he finally found an older man named Pete Carson, who had been a freight worker at the time. Pete was now in his 60s and nearly blind, but his memory was sharp. "Sure, I remember that night," Pete said when Caleb questioned him. "March 15th, 1880. I was working late, loading a shipment. I saw Victor Hastings arrive at that old warehouse across the way, the one that belonged to James Thompson. He looked angry as a rattlesnake. About an hour later, I heard shouting, then a gunshot. I was scared, so I hid behind some crates. I saw Hastings leave, and he was alone. Never saw James Thompson come out." "Why did you not tell the sheriff this 5 years ago?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Pete looked down at his weathered hands. "Hastings owns the freight company I worked for. He would have ruined me, maybe killed me too. I had a wife and children to think about. I'm not proud of my silence, but I did what I had to do to survive." "Will you testify now?" Caleb pressed. Pete was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "My wife passed 2 years ago, and my children are grown and gone. I do not have much time left in this world, and I would like to meet my Maker with a clear conscience. Yes, I will testify." Armed with Pete's testimony, the ledger, and the physical evidence from the warehouse, Sheriff Coleman finally had enough to make an arrest. On a crisp October morning, he and Caleb rode to Hastings's grand house on the hill overlooking Tombstone. Victor Hastings was a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes that showed no emotion when Coleman informed him he was under arrest for the murder of James Thompson. He came quietly, too quietly, which made Caleb nervous. "You are making a terrible mistake, Sheriff," Hastings said calmly as they locked him in a cell. "I have friends in high places. This will not end well for you." "The only mistake was thinking you could get away with murder," Coleman replied. The trial was set for 3 weeks later, giving the prosecution time to prepare their case. During those weeks, Caleb spent almost every waking hour with Sarah, helping her prepare to testify and making sure she stayed safe. Hastings had indeed called in favors, and there were attempts to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence. Caleb found himself acting as Sarah's constant protector, walking her to and from work, checking her house for intruders, and staying alert for any sign of danger. During those intense days, their relationship deepened into something neither could deny. They talked for hours about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Caleb learned that Sarah loved poetry and stargazing, that she had taught herself to read Latin, and that she had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh. Sarah discovered that Caleb had grown up on a ranch in Texas, that he had come to Arizona seeking adventure, and that beneath his quiet exterior was a man of deep principle and surprising tenderness. One night, as they sat on Sarah's porch watching the stars, Caleb reached over and took her hand. Sarah looked at him, her green eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said quietly. "When this trial is over, when your father finally has justice, I do not want to stop seeing you. These past weeks with you have been the best of my life. You are the strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I am falling in love with you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I am falling in love with you too, Caleb. You came into my life when I had given up hope of ever knowing the truth about my father. You gave me back my faith that good people still exist in this world. Whatever happens at the trial, I want you to know that you have already given me the greatest gift imaginable. Caleb leaned forward and kissed her gently, and Sarah kissed him back with a passion that took his breath away. They sat together on that porch until dawn, holding each other and talking about a future they both desperately wanted. The trial began on November 2nd, 1885, in the Cochise County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of them Hastings' supporters who glared at Sarah and Caleb with open hostility. But there were also people who had known and respected James Thompson, and they looked at Sarah with sympathy and hope. The prosecutor, a sharp young attorney named William Foster, laid out the case methodically. He presented the ledger showing Hastings' massive debt to Thompson and the threats he had made. He called Pete Carson to the stand, and the old man testified clearly about what he had seen and heard that night in March 1880. He presented evidence from the warehouse, including samples of the bloodstains and photographs of the carved initials. Sarah took the stand on the second day of the trial. She was nervous but composed as she told the court about her father, about his character and his business practices, about how he would never have abandoned her. She explained the music box and how her father had hidden the ledger there, knowing that someday she might need it. Her testimony was powerful and emotional, and Caleb saw several members of the jury wipe their eyes. Hastings' defense attorney, a slick man named Charles Pemberton, who had been brought in from San Francisco, tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case. He argued that the bloodstains could be from anyone, that Pete Carson's memory after 5 years was unreliable, and that the ledger proved only that there was a business dispute, not murder. But the evidence was overwhelming. On the third day of the trial, Foster called a surprise witness, a former employee of Hastings named Robert Mills. Mills testified that Hastings had confessed to him while drunk one night, saying he had killed Thompson in a rage and hidden the body in the desert where it would never be found. He said Thompson was a fool who did not know when to let a debt go, Mills testified. He said he had done what he had to do to protect his interests. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Hastings leapt to his feet, his face red with fury. "That is a lie," he shouted. "I never said any such thing." The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Pemberton desperately tried to discredit Mills, but the damage was done. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Sarah collapsed in tears, and Caleb was there to catch her, holding her tightly as the courtroom buzzed with reaction. Hastings was sentenced to hang, though his lawyers promised appeals that would likely drag on for years. But none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was that James Thompson's name had been cleared and his killer had been brought to justice. Sheriff Coleman shook Caleb's hand afterward, his eyes warm with approval. "You did good work, Monroe. Real good work. If you ever want a pin on a badge permanently, you let me know." But Caleb had other plans. That evening, as the sun set over the desert in brilliant shades of orange and gold, he took Sarah to a small hill overlooking Tombstone. They stood together, watching the light fade, and Caleb turned to face her. "Sarah Thompson, you are the most incredible woman I have ever known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have been through hell, but you never gave up, never lost your integrity or your kindness. I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you have made me. Will you marry me?" Sarah's face shone with joy as she threw her arms around him. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Caleb Monroe, I will marry you. 1,000 times yes." They were married in a simple ceremony at the small church in Tombstone on December 15th, 1885, exactly 9 months after Caleb had first walked into that abandoned warehouse. Sarah wore a dress of ivory lace that she had sewn herself, and Caleb wore his best suit with a new black hat. Sheriff Coleman stood as his best man, and several of Sarah's friends from the sewing circle attended as witnesses. After the ceremony, they held a small reception at one of the local hotels. People who had shunned Sarah for years now came to congratulate her and apologize for believing the worst about her father. She accepted their apologies with grace, though Caleb could see the pain in her eyes. Some wounds took longer to heal than others. Caleb had saved enough money to buy a small ranch about 10 miles outside of Tombstone, a place with good water and enough land to run cattle. They moved there after the wedding, and Sarah threw herself into making it a real home. She planted a garden, sewed curtains for the windows, and filled the house with warmth and laughter that Caleb had never known before. Life was not always easy. Ranching was hard work, and there were years when the drought made everything more difficult. But they faced every challenge together, supporting each other through the tough times and celebrating the good ones. Caleb took occasional work as a deputy when Sheriff Coleman needed extra help, and Sarah built a reputation as the finest seamstress in the county, taking on special projects that brought in valuable extra income. In the spring of 1887, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. Caleb was overjoyed, fussing over her constantly and making sure she did not overwork herself. On a cold January night in 1888, with a midwife in attendance and Caleb pacing anxiously outside, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him James, after Sarah's father. Holding his son for the first time, Caleb felt tears stream down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered to Sarah, who looked exhausted but radiant. "You are perfect. I love you more than words can say." "I love you too," Sarah said softly, touching Caleb's face. "Thank you for giving me back my life. Thank you for loving me." 2 years later, they had a daughter, whom they named Grace. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and she was as spirited as James was calm. The ranch prospered as the children grew, and Caleb and Sarah built a life filled with love, hard work, and deep contentment. Victor Hastings was eventually hanged in 1889 after his appeals were exhausted. Sarah did not attend the execution, choosing instead to visit her father's grave with Caleb and their children. They laid flowers and said prayers, and Sarah finally felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for nearly a decade. "He can rest now," she said quietly, holding Caleb's hand as James toddled among the headstones and baby Grace slept in Caleb's arms. "Justice was served, just like you promised." "Your father would be so proud of you," Caleb said, kissing her temple. "Proud of the woman you are, the mother you have become, the life you have built from ashes." As the years passed, the story of how Caleb Monroe had reopened a cold case and brought a murderer to justice became something of a legend in Tombstone. People spoke of it in saloons and at town meetings, always with a note of satisfaction that good had triumphed over evil, that truth had won out over lies. But for Caleb and Sarah, the real story was quieter and more personal. It was about two people who found each other in the midst of tragedy and built something beautiful together. It was about love that grew from shared purpose and deepened through years of partnership. It was about justice, yes, but also about mercy, forgiveness, and the healing power of finding someone who sees you completely and loves you anyway. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1895, Caleb took Sarah back to that hill overlooking Tombstone where he had proposed. Their children were with Sarah's friend for the day, giving them rare time alone together. They sat on a blanket, watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, leaning against Caleb's shoulder. "Marrying a woman with such a complicated past? Taking on someone else's fight?" Caleb wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You were never someone else's fight, Sarah. From the moment I met you, you were my fight, my purpose, my future." Finding that evidence in the warehouse was not just about solving your father's murder, it was about finding you. Sarah tilted her face up to kiss him, a kiss that still held all the passion and tenderness of their early days together. "I used to think the best thing you ever did was bring my father's killer to justice," she said. "But I was wrong. The best thing you ever did was teach me how to love again, how to trust again, how to believe in happy endings." "We made our own happy ending," Caleb said, "together." They watched the sun disappear below the horizon, painting the sky in deeper shades of purple and red. In the distance, they could see the lights of Tombstone beginning to glow in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there was the warehouse where this had all begun, where a cowboy had found evidence that would change 2 lives forever. Caleb thought about that day often, about how a thrown horseshoe and a few minutes of curiosity had led him to the love of his life. It was funny how fate worked sometimes, how the smallest decisions could lead to the most profound consequences. If he had not stopped at that particular spot, if he had not decided to explore the warehouse while waiting for the blacksmith, if he had not looked down at just the right moment to see those bloodstains, his entire life would have been different. But he had stopped. He had looked. He had found the evidence. And in doing so, he had found Sarah. As they rode back to the ranch that evening, Caleb and Sarah talked about their plans for the future. James was 7 now and showing an interest in ranching, wanting to help his father with the cattle and horses. Grace was 5 and already reading at an advanced level, inheriting her mother's love of learning. They talked about maybe having another child, about expanding the ranch, about the life they were building together one day at a time. When they arrived home, the children came running out to greet them, full of stories about their day. Caleb scooped up Grace while Sarah hugged James, and they all went inside together. Sarah prepared dinner while Caleb helped the children with their evening chores, and then they all sat down together at the table Caleb had built with his own hands. These were the moments Caleb treasured most. Not the dramatic days of the investigation or the trial, not the satisfaction of seeing justice served, but these quiet family evenings filled with laughter and love. This was what they had fought for, what all the danger and difficulty had been about. This simple, perfect life they had created together. After the children were asleep, Caleb and Sarah sat together on the porch, as they did most evenings. The desert night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead. Sarah rested her head on Caleb's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Tell me again," she said softly, as she sometimes did. "Tell me about the day you found the evidence." Caleb smiled and began the story, describing every detail of that September evening in 1885. How the light had fallen through the broken windows, how his heart had raced when he saw the bloodstains, how the world had seemed to shift beneath his feet when he realized what he had found. And then he told her about the moment she had walked through that warehouse door and how his life had truly begun in that instant. "I knew right away that you were special," he said, "even before I knew your name, even before I understood the significance of what I had found. I looked at you, and I just knew." Sarah lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes soft in the starlight. "I knew too," she admitted. "I was terrified and heartbroken when you showed me my father's initials, but there was something about you that made me feel safe. Like maybe after all those years of being alone, someone finally understood." "You will never be alone again," Caleb promised, as he had promised 100 times before. "I will be here always, in this life and whatever comes after." They sat together in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the stars wheel slowly across the sky. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams 7-year-olds and 5-year-olds dream. The ranch was quiet except for the occasional sound of cattle settling for the night and the whisper of the desert wind. This was their happy ending, hard-won and precious. A cold case reopened by chance, evidence found by a cowboy with a good heart and sharp eyes, justice finally served after 5 long years. But more than that, it was a love story, the kind that the poet Sarah loved to read would write about. It was about 2 souls finding each other against all odds, about healing and hope, about building something lasting from tragedy and pain. Years later, when Caleb and Sarah were old and gray, they would sit on this same porch with their grandchildren and tell them the story of how they met. The children would listen with wide eyes, enthralled by tales of murder investigations and courtroom drama. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was simpler than that. It was about a man who saw an injustice and could not walk away, about a woman who never gave up hope, even when the whole world had given up on her, about how love can bloom in the darkest places, and how two people can save each other if they are brave enough to try. The cold case had been reopened. The cowboy had found the evidence. Justice had been served. But the greatest victory was not in the courtroom or in the execution of a murderer. The greatest victory was here, on this porch, in this life they had built together, in the love they shared and the family they had created, in every sunrise they watched together and every sunset that painted their world in gold. Caleb Monroe had made sure justice was finally served right. But in doing so, he had also found something he had not known he was looking for: a home, a family, and a love that would last forever. And that, in the end, was the truest justice of all.